This is why the C6 Corvette is the best drift chassis in the world. We spent the last 12 months building a C6 Corvette from the ground up, developing and redesigning everything that has to do and defines a Corvette as what is known to be one of the best road race cars. We reverse engineered everything and made it the best drift car. In this video, we're going to define what the Corvette's problems were and how we solved them over the last 12 months. The original design of the Corvette was based on a race car first. Then it was made into a production car, which explains the simplicity but also the performance of the suspension on this chassis. The C6 Corvette ran from 2005 to 2013, very similar to the C5 Corvette, which ran from 97 to 2004. We're not going to talk about the C5, there are a lot of similarities, but the C6 is the ultimate drift car over the C5. Out of the box, the Corvette works incredibly well. It has the right engine and drivetrain to support high horsepower and lots of easy skids. You can simply disconnect the ABS fuse, do a couple mods to the car, and you are ready to drift. The problem is higher levels of drifting and adding a lot of steering angle. You run into what we have found sets it apart from being the best chassis. So with the help of FTF Race Shop products and myself designing them, we were able to make this chassis into the best drift chassis. So let's start with the front suspension. We all know that the Corvette has a steering rack that is right in the way of the engine. It's also at a really bad angle for the angle kit itself. Having the rack located this far forward introduces what's called toe curve. Toe curve is when the input of the steering rack or steering wheel is not linear with the amount of angle that the wheel is turning. This graph well illustrates what is happening with the OEM steering rack versus the FDF rack relocation. If you want to look at this graph in depth, pause it and take a look. With our rack relocation, we were able to put a BMW E46 rack within the subframe where the leaf spring used to be. Yes, a Corvette was in fact a leaf spring car, and it had shocks mounted to the control arms with a fiber leaf spring that spanned the width of the car. Using this pocket, we conveniently located and made a bracket for the BMW rack, and it opened up the doors for a fantastic angle kit on this chassis. Now, moving the rack, it was almost 4.5 inches back and 4.5 inches down. This location is completely obscene in the terms of relocating a rack. Usually you're moving a rack 25 to 50 millimeters or 1 to 2 inches in either direction. This moves it a ridiculous amount. So it required a knuckle design that looked crazy, and it's completely different than anything that you've ever seen on a Corvette. The other benefits to moving the steering rack is it opens up the door for engine swaps and superchargers and pulley setups for the LS or even inline 6 engines like the 2JZ and RB, which this kit has actually facilitated a few people in swapping the Corvettes. You're gonna start seeing 2JZ swap, RB swapped Corvettes very soon. The other issues with the front suspension is that it was simply designed for road racing. So the camber gain, the travel range, and everything around it was not developed for drifting. We needed more travel range and we needed a different camber curve to maintain traction because drifting is essentially the opposite of road racing. We're steering with the rear of the car and we're counter steering with the front. So camber gain in a certain aspect for cornering loads up the outside wheel where we're actually loading up the inside wheel. Making these changes and then proving that this car works and how fast the car was able to go based on its front grip potential was proven at the last round of the Gambler where we won for the first time driving this car in a competition. Keeping the video flow going, let's go on to the rear suspension. The rear suspension had a few issues of its own as well. It also had a camber curve issue. It had a camber adjustment problem where we weren't easily able to adjust camber, which in drifting is a big deal. The anti-squat in this car was actually too high for drifting and we needed to make an adjustable anti-squat option. And then we also needed to have a toe gain adjustment option. So under compression, are we gaining toe? This is also called bump steer for those of you who like racing, but in drifting, based on the analytics that we've collected, toe gain under compression or under acceleration actually improves the traction of the car quite a bit. So we want to introduce this into the rear kit, which the factory suspension simply didn't have. So we took it upon ourselves to solve all of these problems, making an anti-squat adjustment bracket which lowers and raises the front of the control arm, the lower control arm, giving us 4 locations possible, all varying different percentages. The toe gain adjustment that we were able to incorporate is a simple bracket on the knuckle where you can raise and lower the pickup point of the toe arm, giving you toe in under compression or 0 toe change under compression. The camber change that we were able to introduce is simple shims at the knuckle where we can fine tune the camber while drifting, or the upper and lower control arms are fully adjustable at the subframe sides. In addition to this, we changed the roll center and the pickup points on the knuckle itself. This also improved the camber gain, where we were able to figure out how to get almost zero camber gain under compression. I know what you're thinking, that may not be the best case, but we're also able to adjust this camber gain as well. So we could, for example, on a bank track, have one side of the car gaining camber under compression and the other side not gaining any camber at all. This is going to introduce more grip potential while hitting the bank because the bank compresses one side of the suspension a lot more than the other. We were also able to add a very fine-tunable sway bar that uses our own spline kit, and all of these adjustments made this car infinitely better on top of what was already a good chassis. One of the best parts that comes with the Corvette is the drivetrain. It's got an LS from factory. Obviously, that's going to be ideal for anyone looking for good power right out of the gate, but it has a pesky torque tube that connects to a rear transmission and then a big bulky diff that's difficult to change if you ever have any issues with it. So to create a solution for the drivetrain problems, we added an 850 wheel horsepower engine built by FabMac Industries. We added some nitrous and it revs to 8,500 RPM. So that took care of the horsepower problems. Not that there really was any, but we needed a lot of jam to turn the big tires and the grip that we wanted to push with this car. We also mounted a GSR front transmission. So it's a 4-speed dog box that we cut out the transmission tunnel in order to fit within the chassis. The transmission tunnel is actually quite big. It didn't need much to fit this. And with that, we run a standard drive shaft and then our quick change. With the quick change, we simply 3D scanned the quick change, 3D scanned the subframe, and then we took the scans, we put them together, and we said, we can easily make a bracket for this. You do not need to mount the quick change upside down. That induces a lot of additional costs. The way that we made our quick change mount uses the standard orientation of the quick change. You only need to grind a little bit of the subframe to maintain the same axle center position as factory, and it has perfect pinion angles for the drive shaft. Based on the angle of your engine mounting position, the drive shaft angle has a 1.5 degree difference, which is perfect for either U-joint coming out of the transmission and going into the diff. So you don't need to worry about anything to do with your drive shaft pinion angles, and a standard U-joint drive shaft is going to work perfectly. We run a carbon fiber drive shaft shop drive shaft, and we run DSS drive shaft shop axles as well that are rated for over 1,000 horsepower. So we didn't have any problems with the drivetrain during our competition running the 285 Vitor tire, which was a fantastically grippy tire. The chassis itself, obviously we built this car from the ground up. We took everything off of it, every nut, bolt, and washer. And a fun fact, we actually put the car together, making sure that every bolt that we used was the same size head, so that we knew that this car was only ever going to use 10, 13, 17, 19, and 22 sockets, making us only need a certain amount of tools to undo anything on the car. With that, the chassis is also an extremely rigid chassis. Unlike a unibody, a frame rail based chassis like the Corvette is low center of gravity, very rigid, and very strong. Like I said, the way that they designed this was based on racing, and it was not based on a passenger vehicle. The frame rail design, though, introduced some challenges. Because of how bulky they are, there's actually minimal areas to mount things like batteries and pumps and fire suppression systems. Everything is confined within frame rails that are very narrow at the front and rear, and then they only go wide where the passenger sits. So this introduced an issue where we had to get creative on how to mount things like our surge tanks and our fire suppression systems. Like I said, we got creative. It's a full steel chassis, so we were able to mount and weld things to it easily, including air jacks, which made it really easy to work on the car, change the tires, do alignments, corner balance the car. All of those things are amazing when you have air jacks. The body of the car introduced a couple challenges as well. Because, like I said, it's a frame rail chassis that relied on fiberglass inner fenders for the front and the rear. We didn't want to run those factory fiberglass fenders. So when we're moving them, it made it difficult to mount a body kit on top of it because we had no reference point for where to mount them. Luckily, we had Sultan send us some carbon fiber inner fenders, which still required some customization and mounting, but basically with some custom fabrication, mounting the body kit wasn't terrible, although a unibody is easier. The good part about a Corvette is that it has really high-end available parts for its body, like the Kevlar kit from HTK, which you can buy from Drift HQ. This body is super durable when it comes to having impacts and running into people and things and stuff. It's a carbon Kevlar skin with carbon fiber on the inside of the doors and on the roof and on the dash. It's really expensive though, so that is a downside. If you're building a Corvette though, I'm assuming that you have some budget because the Corvette itself, just to buy as a base, is quite expensive. The interior was awfully spacious when I'm just sitting on the floor with no seat, but as soon as I introduced a seat with any brackets available, including our own, my head was up into the ceiling. My head was up into the roof. So luckily I made some custom brackets that mounted the seat extremely far back and basically on the floor that would still meet any regulation, and I was then comfortable. I had tons of room for my legs. The factory pedals and the factory column worked extremely well. The only thing is I find the shifter and the handbrake location a little bit far away. You kind of have to straight arm it when you go to reach for it, but other than that, based on my size, I'm easily able to do it. It's just a little bit different than my S14. All in all, it's a very comfortable cockpit. I love it in there. I'm gonna set up some USB charge ports and a cell phone holder with a two-way switch so I can get music going in my helmet. We're really gonna make the interior of this Corvette comfortable and good for competition. Also, one other thing, the transmission tunnel is super tall. It was to fit the torque tube to the transaxle, and because of that, your elbows can run into it. Other than that though, it feels like a cockpit of like a fighter jet, and it's pretty cool. So the interior and then the cage as well from Cage Kits fits me well. It doesn't interfere with my body much, other than the transmission tunnel. Now, the one cool part about the car was the braking system. From factory, it actually kind of sucks. You have an electric ABS system that's really annoying to work around, and the booster is massive. It's in the way. It kind of takes up a lot of the engine bay. But we were able to look at this and say, here's a problem, let's come up with a solution. So we made a bias bar dual master brake mounted pedal box, as you will, that replaces the booster but maintains the factory pedals. So we made a brake lever that connects to this box, stays within the engine bay, gives you a bias bar so you can bias both masters for the front and the rear. You can mechanically bias it to the front like we want to do in drifting. You can run your brake lines separate front to rear, giving you an extra safety factor of if something fails, you're still going to have half the system available. We also included a brake proportioning valve to the rear brakes so that we can bias it even further. And the braking system in this car is amazing. I know you guys want to talk about the inboard brakes. The inboard brakes actually worked incredibly well. I ran them in as an inline setup, and the only reason I changed them back to the wheel mounted setup was because I personally didn't like the inline setup. And for me to mount 4 calipers on the diff instead of 2 was gonna really clog up that area in the center of where the diff is. One thing is for sure, I want the diff to be able to be pulled out easily, and having 4 calipers and 4 brake lines, although it would be really nice not having brake lines on the suspension side of things, having all of that on the diff side would be kind of annoying. So it's not dead yet. I might go back to 4 calipers on the diff, but for now, that's the only reason we switched. Otherwise, it worked great. It is interesting to think about how the load path goes through the diff and the subframe rather than through the suspension. And while pulling the handbrake, actually with the caliper on the wheel and the knuckle, it is binding up those ball joints and rotating or trying to rotate the suspension. So it was really interesting to me to see how the car would behave on handbrake when those loads are no longer going to be traveling through the suspension. It also reduced 12 pounds per corner of unsprung weight, which if you know anything about suspension, it is imperative to reduce unsprung weight so that you have very good dampening control. 12 pounds over a 24-inch arm is a lot of weight, and it's a lot less dampening and work that shock has to do if you're able to remove it. All in all, I know that I didn't cover the entire foundation of the chassis because we spent 12 months and documented the entire thing through almost 40 episodes of building this Corvette, which you can easily reference through this video. Just check out our channel and you can see everything there. But this just encompasses why I believe the Corvette, with the modifications that I described, is actually the best chassis ever for drifting. The only reason I say that is because I handpicked based on all the chassis that I've designed suspension for, and I determined that with this car, its maximum potential speed in corner is much faster than basically any other chassis because of its lower center of gravity, its track width, and its wheelbase. It is the perfect car to outperform anything else, especially if it's on the same tire. Tires are 80% of the chassis' ability to do anything. 20% is what you can do with the car itself. And the Corvette maxes out that 20% hands down. So we now have the potential of 100% maxed out potential chassis, giving us obviously the best advantage in competition. Not that speed is everything, but the control that the car has and its recovery ability. I could not believe how much I was able to adapt and change, and even if I made a mistake, I was able to recover really quickly, much faster than I was able to in my S14, and I believe I maxed out the potential of my S14 as well. This is a quick video of what I think is the best drift car ever, and it does have to do and require a lot of the components that I designed. Luckily for you guys, I will be selling all of the components, and we are also building a second Corvette that will be demonstrated at SEMA, and we are going to take it even to another level, going with some cantilever suspension designs, an exhaust exit that's going to travel over the frame rails and down the sides and exit out of where the rockers used to be, and we're going to go crazy with it. So stay tuned for that, because we're probably going to put a lot of that content on the channel. 2024 is looking like a fantastic year for us. That is my opinion on the Corvette. If you guys have any objections, I'd love to debate with you in the comments. So thank you guys for watching. That's the end of this video. See you on the next one.